Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Connecting the Dots, a new model for people-centric performance management. My name is Sabina Iyengar, and I'll be your moderator for today. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so you know how to participate in today's event. All attendees are in view-only mode. Please submit any questions in the Q&A window at the side of your screen. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. The speakers will address them during the Q&A section of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and all attendees will receive the replay of the webinar. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Doug Dennerline, CEO and Executive Chairman at Betterworks and former President of SuccessFactors, and Stacy Harris, our Chief Research Officer and Managing Partner at Sapient Insights Group.
Thanks, Sabina. We're really excited to have this conversation. Appreciate you taking the time to do some introductions. If you don't have a chance to know a little bit about Sapient Insights and Betterworks, Sapient Insights is a research firm that focuses on HR technology and systems and how organizations are leveraging them. So we're going to have a great conversation today talking about how that research is impacting the market. And Doug, you have been in the performance management space for as long as I can remember. And I say that with the kindest comment. You've really been working on performance management since before there was a talent management conversation, back when we were first in the trenches talking about what is performance management. So I'm so excited to have this conversation with you.
No, thank you. I'm excited to be here. Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, SuccessFactors was the first company to basically move the performance process to the cloud, if you will. And ever since then, I've been with my team trying to invent a process that is, has better effects on organizations than the traditional process did. If you think about it, Stacy, it's over 70 years old, and it was built for hierarchical organizations. So maybe there's a way we should innovate a little bit off something that's, that has that age.
Vintage is good. I mean, I like my vintage clothing. I love my vintage, artwork, but I'm not sure I like vintage as much when you're talking about processes for talent, right?
Exactly.
Most people don't realize this, but performance management, the traditional performance management, was started out in the U.S. Army. It was part of sort of how the Department of Defense evaluated the entire force, right? And how they were sort of maintaining and managing all the things that has to be done from a defense perspective. And we took it and adapted it to an HR perspective. So you're right. It is a 70-year-long conversation that we've been having with the market. Doug, one of the things that I know we're seeing in our research is that it's 70 years in the making, but today, only 68% of organizations have told us in our research that they have a current approach or current application that they're using for performance management. And funny enough, compared to last year's data, because we do this annually, it's in our 25th year, so we're kind of vintage too in it, doing our research. But just last year, before, it was at 75%. Now, some of that number kind of goes up and down as you get smaller companies. But we saw learning go up. We saw onboarding go up last year. We saw all these other application areas go up, and performance management went down. Our take on that is that people actually making the decision to stop using performance management systems. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that? Do you think that's what's happening in the market and maybe why some of that was happening?
Well, yeah, there's no question that the dynamic change we all went through with the pandemic and everybody forced into a remote situation, that people were overwhelmed, and the amount of time they were spending in Zooms and they were getting burnt out. And so just to add another process, it creates stress. And candidly, the old annual performance review process does create stress. It's not seen, it doesn't add value. It's more critical, backwards looking. That a lot of HR people decided just to put it on pause for the time being. I think we're seeing, and we felt that in our company, absolutely. The interest in buying new innovative software in the middle of a pandemic was not there. But it's almost flipped the other way now, Stacy, where people are realizing, well, they need performance management. They need some kind of process. And they realize the old processes aren't going to do it in this new environment and are searching for something different.
Yeah, I think the pandemic was a big part of it. We also saw, even before I think of the pandemic, this conversation that was happening in the market where we were seeing a lot of organizations saying, we're just going to, abolish our performance management process. It wasn't even, we're going to change it. We're going to get rid of it completely.
Yeah.
I did find, at least in our data set, and that's been probably a conversation that's going on for maybe 3-4 years now. We found that a lot of those organizations who had completely abolished their performance management process came back and said, oh, we need to have something, right? So we did see a little bit of an up and down wave in our data set because of that. But I would agree. I think that the pandemic, as well as the retention issues that we were seeing and the hiring issues that people were going through, really put a different spin on what is performance management doing for my organization. And one of the things that we really wanted to talk about today is what is an innovative approach to performance management? Because I think there's been a lot of conversation about the words continuous performance management, but when you look at that practically, and you have to think about something like changing your compensation process or changing your approach to, how people get, annual raises, or what's your approach within your organization for making sure people get moved into new roles. Those are highly connected to your performance management process. Our data shows about probably 60-70% of organizations are still using what we would consider an annual traditional or biannual process right now.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what you think would be more innovative and what continuous really means?
Well, that's what we're 9 years into this at Betterworks, and this is how, what we spend all of our waking moments trying to reinvent. And, unfortunately or unfortunately, I think the traditional process is, there's so many downstream things that you talked about that HR people need the annual thing to be tied to. If you do ratings, and a lot of people do ratings so that they know, how to compensate their best people or manage out their lowest performers. To move to something that, that's compliance driven. It's, HR people having to police the system, and that's not a fun job for them. To something that we've been spending time on, trying to move that process to the individual contributor that they actually see value in. It's not something that they dread. It's coming up and it's recency bias filled. It's constant conversations, and they're lightweight in the application. That is done, by a quarterly check-in. We think quarterly is the right cadence, and maybe a mid-quarter check-in, where it actually forces a conversation between a manager and an individual contributor. And the conversations are, it's lightweight. It's around, what are you doing? What are you working on this quarter? Is it tied to the top company goals that the company's trying to achieve? And therefore they feel better engaged because they actually feel like they know their work is actually helping the company achieve something. And they're also hopefully having a conversation with a manager about, who do I want to be in this organization? And how can you help me get there? What are the skills I need in order to get there? So have a couple developmental goals. And so, versus just being a tax on the individual contributor, now it seems value, right? It's something that, hey, my manager knows what I'm working on. They talk to me about it. It's about my achievement, not backwards looking on, telling me what I did good or didn't do good a year ago. Because, it just doesn't, the irony of the performance management process to me, Stacy, is pretty wild. It's like, candidly, it's who you like and who you don't like.
Well, it's funny. I'm laughing because I've heard you say a couple of things that we actually see in our survey, the comments around these, right? So, performance management gets the most comments in our data. When we get over 5,000 people who write in comments about what they like or don't like about their systems. And it's funny how very specific they are about performance management. And much of it is what you just said, which is, we have to do this. It's so onerous. It takes up too much time from the managers. I loved your language, the tax on the employees or the tax on the managers. But you're right. They think of it as, it's time I have to put into something and I'm not sure that's adding value, right? Like, depending on, any side of the spectrum you're on, but you're like, if I'm going to be taxed, I want to know there's something I'm going to get out of it that's good for the company and for me too. And I think that's the piece that we've lost in this conversation. We do a lot thinking we need data for the company. I don't know that we do a lot thinking we need data for the employee themselves. And that has to do a little bit with the learning you talked about. But I think also we like feedback, particularly this next generation coming into the market. Feedback's important to them. So it isn't just about the fact that I think we're going to check the box and say we've evaluated them. They want meaningful feedback. And I believe that's some of what you guys are talking about as well, right?
100%. It's really great when we find an organization that understands that their processes are old and antiquated. And what I say, Stacy, it takes a progressive CEO who knows that he or she knows that people are their most important asset. And then finding an HR leader that what I call is progressive, it's not about helping the company's people perform better. It's helping the company, having the people do their jobs effectively, and therefore the company performs better. I think it's important that the reason we do this is we want the company to perform better than if it doesn't, if you have an innovative process. And we see this in the effort people put in. So we just did a piece of research too, Stacy, where we interviewed 2,500 people around the world, and about half of them were on the Betterworks platform and half were not. And things like we saw a 25% increase in engagement scores in people that were using Betterworks. We saw a 44% increase in people's effort they put into their job. Because again, they're feeling connected to the work that they're doing, to what the goals of the organization are. And those companies are performing, I promise, much better than those. You'll lower turnover when people feel engaged. And certainly, we talk about, the quiet resignation these days, where people are on the job but not doing the job. In a platform like ours, with those constant conversations, you know exactly what people are doing every day or not doing every day. And it gives great insight to managers and causes that conversation to happen more frequently.
Yeah, I mean, I think the quiet resignation is a great piece of sort of, we've been through the change of the entire market through the great resignation, as everybody called it, right? And I just saw a note saying today, like 70% of employees are worried about their current jobs, right? They don't know where they stand. And I think that's, the quiet resignation isn't just about I've stopped being engaged. There's also fear of, am I going to lose my job? Are they going to move something? Do my goals and the company's goals match up? And that nobody wants to work and live in fear, right? That's right. It's not a pleasant place. So it's not just about getting accountability. It's about helping your employees feel good about the work they're doing and the space they're going to be in on a daily basis, right?
Yeah, one of the roles I had historically was I was a senior leader at Cisco Systems, and I had 6,000 employees, and so I lived on the other sides of these processes, and they were so biased based. I mean, people would sit down to write a review, and really, unless they were good note takers around conversations they had with employees, they were making it up, literally making it up about what this body of work looked like. When you do these continuous conversations in the application, you see what people's goals are, you see what feedback they've gotten, you see if they've gotten recognition in the organization, and so their body of work sits right there as you're evaluating them on a 45-day basis. And so it's much more based on the body of work. And so the person actually goes, okay, they really understand what I do. They're not making it up at the end of the year about, whether they like me or don't like me. And it makes a huge difference.
It does. And I think, platforms aside, just the processes that we're talking about today, right? More engagement, more touch points, more feedback for the employee, more opportunities to tie the current business goals. And we all know business goals are changing almost on a monthly basis in some cases, right? That if you do a touch base every 6 months, that business goals probably changed maybe 3 times in that 6 months.
Right.
All of those things, I think, are what we're saying in our research. It sounds like what you're seeing in your research. It sounds like what we're hearing. I'm watching the Q&A on. I'm like, oh, I want to talk about that. So we just so everyone knows, we are going to get to the Q&A comments. So Bart Reed and a couple others have put some great comments and questions in here. Those are the elements, I think, of what we would consider the innovative performance management approach. And whether you call it performance management or people performance or your performance experience, the idea is that people want to understand how they're connected to the performance of the business, I think is the goal that we're seeing in the market.
Well, and I think the other huge change that I'm experiencing and seeing, and that I think is a really good one, is it's not the heavy-handed manager anymore. It's all about empathy, and I call it work-life integration. It's about not integrating work into your life. It's about integrating work into your life, not the other way around.
Yeah.
And being at work when you need to be at work, and being with the family and the children as they're going through school and all those things that they have to deal with. That's when you get the best out of people, when you really know what's their issues. I mean, are they home with two children and they dealing with two babies, and you're taking that into consideration and how you manage their time. I'm a CEO who is all around achievement, right? I see these people now that are they're putting software on their computers for taking snapshots of during the day of when you're at or not at your computer, or they're doing counting keystrokes. Yes. Who would want to work in a company that was like that? I know I certainly wouldn't, but I see in really interesting companies doing some of those things.
It's a number that's increasing. I will say we've got a stat this year the numbers aren't exact. I haven't got them all calculated yet, but I'll tell you, it is a sad thing. We are seeing that increase. Yeah. And I think there's better ways to think about this conversation, right? Which I think is what we're talking about. And part of this, and let's, our next piece of conversation on this is that hybrid remote work. I think that's some of the reason we're seeing the increase in those, what we would call surveillance type of performance goals, right? Whether that's keystrokes or internet tracking or GPS tracking or video tracking, audio. I always tell people, when you're thinking about HR and any kind of performance-based surveillance, you have to make sure you're not crossing that creepy line in HR, right?
No question.
But I do understand, when you step back, remote work is new for a lot of companies. We had a stat where we looked at what percentage of organizations had 50% or more of their workforce working remotely before the pandemic. It was just 6% of organizations. Our data, and there will be new data coming out in a few months, but currently we're probably seeing somewhere in the range of 30% of organizations who still have 50% or more of their workforce working remotely today. That's a massive jump in 2 years. Yeah. So maybe talk a little bit about how you think this innovative approach to performance management can be a way to get the achievement conversation, which I think is important as a CEO, and not have to cross that creepy line that we're all talking about, right?
To me, at the center of the innovation that we are trying, our best companies, people like Intuit use us worldwide. The center of the conversation between manager and individual contributor is goals. And in their case, they use the OKR methodology. You don't have to do that, but it can be any methodology. It's, the company publishing every quarter what the 4 or 5 most important things the company is working on, and then being able to look up at those in the application and say, well, if that's what's important to the company, then what do I do in my role? What are my 2 or 3 biggest things I need to work on in my job to help the company achieve those goals? And then that's what the conversation's about. It's not about your performance. It's around what are you doing now? How can I help you? Do you have the tools you need? How can I lower barriers for you? It's helping them achieve. And whether you're home or in an office together, you can see progress inside the application on how these people are doing against those goals every day. I mean, our average user in our application is in our application every 7 days. And the really good people do it for minutes every day. Just show, and we try to do it also so they can be in their flow of work. So if you live in Gmail or Outlook or Salesforce or Jira as an engineer, there's a side panel and you can just update your goals from within the app you're in. You don't have to leave and go into our application. So it's easy, and it's, it's not a burden on the individual attacks. It's right there.
Yeah, I mean, your mind, I might be dating myself, but your conversation brought to mind the whole "help me, help you" that we used to hear from the movie, back in the day, right? There is a bit of, I think, and I as a manager and as a coach, right, and in the data that we're seeing from organizations is that in the remote environment, it feels like a lot of organizations feel like, well, we understand how to help our employees in person, but we're not sure we know how to help our employees when it's a remote work environment. And I go a little bullpucky on that because where people sit doesn't really make a big difference in the work they're doing. I think organizations oftentimes have to maybe rethink the engagement model a little bit. Yeah. But what I will say is that, and this hasn't changed much, our data has shown that whether people were working remotely or whether they're working in person, 17% of organizations say, only 17% of organizations are saying their current performance management systems are always meeting their business needs. We asked about business needs. And I think that gets to what you were just talking about. Maybe the question is, what is our business need? Is it that I absolutely have to have a compensation and a rating number? Or is the business need better focused on how I help that employee do whatever they need to do to achieve the business goals, right? So it's much more of a, what do I need to do to help you versus what do you need to do to help me conversation. Yeah. Am I getting that right, do you think?
No, yeah, yes. So I'm a person that doesn't believe in ratings. Again, a process that I really never understood especially if you're doing a bell curve, a forced bell curve. You're basically saying to 70% of the organization, you're mediocre, thanks for being here. These 15% of the people we're really going to take care of, and you 10% at the bottom, we're going to get fired in the next 6 months. What is the value in that? There's just no value to someone about a rating, but people need it. HR people think they need it because it drives who's going to get what portion of the pie. Maybe you have a 30 or 40% of your population that you actually need to take care of, not just 15%. We're trying to invent things, Stacy, that uses a little bit of science inside of all this data inside the app to tell you where your best performers are. And we have all this data, and we can actually apply it to a 9-box or a 4-box or whatever you might want to do traditionally in large companies, looking at the body of work and putting 3 managers, people in a 9-block, and then using science, and then calibrating against that in a room when you get in the room and talk about, who should all be in the 9-box. Maybe somebody needs to go back to not quite ready for, promotion, and using that data to know where your top performers are based on, again, on science and data, not someone's opinion.
Not a forced rating number, which I think we have definitely seen in the market is not working. It's interesting. I did a bit of research. It's been a while now, but on high potentials. Organizations had slotted a bunch of people in high potentials and those who didn't have a high potential. And there was kind of an either or that started to come out, like this shift in the organization where the high potentials were great. Yeah, they stayed. But then you saw all of the non-high potentials, right, start to completely disengage in the organizations. Right. And so by creating this sort of nowhere to go, and you're either in the box or you're out of the box, instead of, as you had mentioned, right, this idea of a more longer view of the conversation with all these different places that you could be doing from a performance level perspective, right? You end up creating divisions where we don't need divisions in the market, right? Yeah. Because you're basically just saying we've used our data to only support one set of people inside of our organization, right?
Well, but that's some of that's a little bit important too, Stacy. I mean, you when we do our quarterly conversations, at the end of a conversation, there's some confidential questions that are just between manager and HR that we propose, things like risk of loss. Mm-hmm. Some of your best people you really don't want to lose. You hate to be that callous in thinking about it, but if you're in the middle and you're doing a nice job and you're in the 5-box, those are I tell people those are my favorite people. They love what they do. They're engaged in it every day, and they're not looking to, for the next thing all the time. I mean, those are great people to have in a company. When everybody wants a promotion, that's where things get a little difficult. But again, using data to figure out where those people are, I think helps HR move off this notion of having to have this annual rating to determine where to put money. It's like, here's the most important people. Let's make sure that. And the other thing we're working on are things like looking at just using natural language processing to assess engagement and find out potentially where your top performers may be looking to leave because they're not engaging in the company or in the application in a meaningful way. And so we've done some hackathon work on things like that with a pretty interesting rating on, percentage of accuracy of determining when people are likely to be leaving.
Yeah, the likely to be leaving conversation, I think, gets a lot of airtime, right? But I liked where you started the conversation too, which is there's value in understanding those who are engaged and understanding what's keeping them, right? What is it that is engaging them? And I think those conversations have to be very balanced, especially when we're thinking about this remote and hybrid work environment. Maybe let's talk a little bit about, if you're doing performance management in an organization that completely has a diverse group of workers who are some on site, some maybe working remotely, maybe some working out in the field. Do you have a sense from your customers of how they're, because now I've got all these continuous check-ins. I'm a manager who's got a lot of things on my plate. Some people I have to touch base with remotely. Some people I have to touch base with in person. I see the people in person more often. Maybe we're going out to lunch more often. Are you finding your companies are leveraging tools like this to make sure they're keeping the connected, or is there other things that they're doing, do you think?
Well, certainly our application helps, no achievement wherever it's happening, whether it's in an office, whether it's, completely hybrid. And we're seeing, it's really interesting to me, Stacy, we're seeing lots of different approaches. I've certainly seen an amazing change in myself as a leader and the productivity in my own company by going to what we call remote first culture. Being able to hire talent wherever they happen to live within a reasonable time frame in terms of the number of hours between you and them and when you're awake or asleep. We've hired some amazing people around the country, and if you measure productivity on revenue per employee, which is what most big companies do, we've seen an incredible increase in that by going remote first. But yes, we have offices in areas of density, and I think it does also matter in terms of how long you've been in career. New in career, those people want to get together in an office. They want to learn from each other. They want to go for drinks after work or have lunches together. Where people like me who are more comfortable not needing any of that at this point. Yeah. But there are many the tools we use internally. We're largely living in Zoom. I mean, I'm the ex-president of WebEx, so I'm. It took a pandemic.
There maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, well, it took a pandemic to teach the world how productive you can be in this environment, done well. Yeah. And then you need tools like the ones that we sell to people so that you can see attainment as it happens. And I would tell you, the end of performance review process, the research says managers spend up to 5 weeks of time. That's a lot of hours writing performance reviews. In our process, it's much less than that. Our goal is to have the manager per individual every quarter spend 15 minutes giving feedback and the individual contributor giving 10 minutes of feedback. That's how long it takes them to do that. So again, much lighter weight in terms of the workload on the managers.
Which is critical when we're talking about a hybrid environment, right? When you are trying to manage the different work styles and different work environments. What about, another thing that comes up a lot when we're talking about hybrid and remote work environments is mobile, right? Like, it's not just that I'm working from a home office. I might be working from my European, summer, home, right? I might be working because, in my environment, I don't have an office space, but my kids have to stay home from school. And so I've got to figure out how to work from my kitchen table with the kids in the bedroom, and I'm trying to make that work. Talk maybe a little bit about how mobility and the ability to use some of these tools helps us understand the environments that our employees are working in maybe a little bit better.
No, I think that's another, unfortunate part of being an HR professional these days I think it's much harder to be an HR leader today than it was 5 years ago. I mean, the demands of trying to figure all this out and help the organization through these processes is, kind of little. I know a lot of HR people, and I've watched many people just walk away from the function. It's like, I just can't handle the pressure.
Yeah.
But what we try to do is we're very, and this isn't an application. This is caring about your people. It's what is your situation, and how can we help optimize you in your situation? Do you need to go to a WeWork locally or a Regis office 2 days a week and so that you can be productive and not in the home because you don't have a place in the home that is good for that? Many companies are offering to put, children help pay for childcare so people can be productive. And so it's just a matter of being creative in terms of, really thinking about each individual and their situation.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, we one of the numbers we track is remote home sort of investments organizations are making. And childcare is one of the fastest growing ones, right?
Yeah.
I think a lot of organizations have for so long been able to kind of put that off to the side and not have to think about that from a workforce perspective. And now they're realizing that investment can lead to some amazing talent inside their organizations, which is powerful, right?
I'm in the middle of writing a bunch of my life's experiences down in a book, and I don't mean a bad commercial here, but it's all the things that I think are important are one of the things that no individual I've ever interviewed in my life ever asked me at the end when I say, is there anything I can answer for you? Saying, tell me about your performance processes internally. I would think new in career coming out of college or second or third job, I would want to know, am I going to get this old antiquated, criticism of my work at once a year, or are you going to be involved in helping me achieve the things I want to achieve? I want to make it a really important thing in the world that you find out and you ask questions about how are you going to take care of me from a performance perspective inside your culture.
Yeah. And that's a powerful thing, saying, knowing that I'm a whole person. I bring everything to work. Right. Yeah. And never be afraid to mention a book. I know how hard that work is. I did it during the pandemic. It is an immense amount of thinking about your life and what you've done. Right.
Yeah.
So yes, we should definitely tout your book, Doug. And when it comes out, I'll be the first person to make sure that I read it. Let's talk a little bit, because I think where we're shifting the conversation is the last topic we wanted to have, and then we'll open it up to questions. I see some great conversations going on the Q&A and the chat window. So by the way, love some of the comments people are making, Karen and Georgia and everyone. Encouraging meaningful connections through transparent, future-directed conversations around performance. This was a bullet point. We talked a little bit about this. Transparency, you mentioned this, right? Like letting new employees know how performance management is done. Letting other employees sort of know what's going on with the performance management process, opening up some of the conversation. But you'd mentioned also there's some conversations about who do we not want to leave. So how do we think differently about that? Talk a little bit about how organizations maybe manage transparency, and maybe the other side of that, Doug, is the fear of what a new performance management process might look like if they've been doing the older process for a long time, because that's what I hear a lot of from HR is fear, right?
It's true. And a couple things. One, in our application, when you do goal setting, we encourage companies to make those transparent for the organization. And so everybody can see everybody else's goals and goal attainment and what they're working on, and comparing what their goals are to somebody else's goals. Am I focused on the right things? And in that, whether that's the CEO or an individual contributor 7 layers down in the organization. So it is fully transparent in that regard. But you hit on something really important, Stacy, which is what I think we do really well and different than most. And it comes from my days at SuccessFactors, my days at Cisco Systems, when the SLAs with people like Goldman Sachs was, for every minute the network was down, we owed them $1 million. So you really had to care a lot about the success of the program you built with Goldman Sachs. We have an incredible knowledge inside of the company around helping people through the change management process, which is really what you're doing, is changing from one process to another. And it takes a few quarters, Stacy, before people see value in the change, right? They're nervous at front, like, I don't know how to do this lightweight thing. I've always done this heavyweight thing, and I do it once a year, and I'm doing it quarterly. And And we just help them build a lightweight program. We help them, start out, just do 2 goals. Let's start out, with a soft approach. And then over the course of time, people see the value of it. And we have many companies we can have them talk to that have been through this change process successfully. Because you know what, if you're an HR leader and you change the process, your phone rings and you get calls from people going, what did you do? And I hate this.
Yes.
And we have to help you have the courage to know that on the other side of that, you're going to be seen as a hero inside the organization, because you're actually going to have a positive impact in the organization. You're going to lower attrition in the way that attrition is happening today. That's an important thing. You're going to see better engagement scores. You're going to see better confidence in leadership, because they now know, they understand the strategy. They see it every quarter. Yeah. They can tie their goals to it, and it's impactful. And I can name nameless numbers of companies that have been through this, and they go, "Wow, this is pretty powerful."
And I like the conversation because we get this often in the research, right? As I said, there's lots of comments in our research about how complex the performance management process is. And sometimes they want a system that can be even more, configurable. Maybe talk a little bit about something like this, where if you do simplify it, if I've got a sales function versus maybe I've got a field-based, repair function, right? Or then maybe I've got a call desk function. How do I customize my performance management process so that it can take advantage of this continuous model, but still meets the needs of maybe like a highly, sophisticated sales environment where I'm hitting goals, versus a call center where I'm working on trying to get people sort of answered and off the phone? What do those two things look like?
This is basically one of the bigger frustrations when you are in a company like ours and selling to human resources. We try to pass along best practices, and looking at all the people that we've implemented, both at SuccessFactors and now at Betterworks. And the best practice is simplification. 100% is such lighter weight than what many people have built up over time. Mm-hmm. But convincing them to move to something that is lighter weight in many cases has been difficult for us. They're like, no, this is our culture. This is how we do it. And they're basically taking what they used to do one time annually and building it 4 times now. And so it becomes complex and a bad experience. You have to let us help you understand and talk to other leaders and HR leaders around the people that did take some advice and make some lighter weight changes, and build a process that people see value in. And whether that's, hourly, and, Stacy, hourly workers has always been hard. Yeah. Because when you need a device in order to give feedback to people, is whether that's their mobile phone or a laptop that's shared, it's always been a tough spot in terms of moving to new practices. But certainly in knowledge worker organizations, we can really help people do something that is significant and changing the way that they think about these processes from the ground up.
Yeah. And I do think, different workforces do have different styles, but I like your message about simplicity. I will say that our data shows that organizations are struggling with this conversation. And so I think the more we can have conversations about transparency and simplicity and the value that can bring, I think, the data does show that sometimes HR can get a little over complicated. And not because I think HR wants to be by any means, but I do think, what we're seeing is that oftentimes it's the businesses asking for something and not realizing what they're going to get from that request. So instead of asking about the outcome they're trying to achieve, you're trying to address the what they think is a need, which is different than an outcome, right?
Well, and I think it's also, full transparency, my opinion, the fear of change. And what could potentially happen if they change.
So maybe as we're kind of wrapping up the conversation and we move into maybe some questions, that I've seen some great conversations in here about stay interviews and transparency and appropriate training for managers. So I think we're going to have some good questions to answer here, Doug. But as a wrap up to our conversation, we promised people that they would come and would talk about innovative performance management, which I think we've done a pretty good job about. We've talked about how organizations are transitioning to remote environments with a performance management model new in their mind, and talking a little bit about creating these connections and how creating these connections can be supported through transparency and simplicity. Maybe just to talk a little bit more, maybe as a wrap up, about how these connections maybe have changed some people's lives, or how they maybe make a different impact for the employee that we often don't think about. Because I know there's a difference between getting a pay raise and knowing that you're connected to a business goal, and having something that actually maybe helps change the journey of your career or something. Can you talk a little bit about that from a connection?
It's been really fun for me in my experience at Betterworks, and I'll talk a little bit about that and just the effects I've seen in my own organization. Our ENPS score is plus 70, which is off the charts in terms of people appreciating the culture here. And we use our own product. Our instance internally is called champagne. So we're drinking our own champagne. And so we try to be best practices on what we do. And we've created a culture of transparency. We created a culture of feedback. Most people, when we leave meetings, people go in and/or recognition. Thank you for that and this effort that you put in place. It's feeling like you belong, and that you're understood, and that your work is appreciated, and you're working on the right things. And it has had an incredible impact on culture. And I don't care if you're a 200-person company or if our largest company is 165,000 people. Doing this new lightweight process and seeing great results from that. It's impactful. It's this constant conversation. And I think one of the questions was, you're right. One of the problems is we force conversations, but we don't necessarily force good conversations. And so we're trying to innovate in that regard too, and putting little bits of video vignettes of in moment education on, you're going to have a difficult conversation with somebody. Here's how you begin that conversation, so that it goes well when you have that conversation. And so we'll start to innovate around that as well. But there's a lot of applications out there, BetterUp and others, where it's all around coaching as well. We have a coaching certification class that we teach as well, that many people take advantage of, and it's teaching people, and it's a difficult class to do because we're strict about that. We have an OKR certification class, so creating the right goals and the right things to achieve those goals, or OKRs, it's objective and key results. It's impactful, Stacy, and it's been fun to watch in my role. And the reason I'm in this role is it's really fun to be in a software company that you can see the impact it has on people when done well. And you wish you could put that movie in every HR person's head so that they could get to the point where they play that movie out.
Yeah, we hear so much from HR professionals that they're overwhelmed right now, and a lot of it is that the workloads are heavy. But I love what you just mentioned there. It isn't just the software. It isn't just the process. You mentioned several things I think that are critical for us to sort of just highlight is coaching, development of the people having the conversations, of the professionals putting in place these new tools. We, like everybody else, and the managers have to have some development. I'll never forget one of the first things I realized when I sort of got through sort of my first 5 or 6 years at corporate entities, right, is that there had been a lot more management training before I had entered the company. And somewhere in the 90s, we got the idea that people could just roll into a supervisor role and without training, right? And I was like, what happened? How did we lose all of the leadership programs? And I was one of the people who was in charge of sort of re-energizing some of that, but it seemed to be a trend, and I think we've seen it go on and on. It's the idea that systems can replace managers. And I think that's the one thing we've learned is it just isn't there. You need to have good managers, but those managers have to have some development of what they're doing.
100%.
It sounds like you guys believe in that as well.
Yeah, very important.
Yeah. Well, I know we're right at about a quarter till, and we promised that we would answer some questions. So let's talk a little bit to our team. Sabina, have we gotten some good questions? I know there's been conversations going on. I'm watching them scroll up the wall. So
yes, exactly. Thank you both. We do have a lot of questions, and just a reminder to the audience, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box on the right side of your screen. And if we don't get to them, we will get to you offline, just so that you're aware. So please put them in there. And the first question I have is, how do you increase buy-in and completion? So we implemented a quarterly review process, and we really struggled to get individual contributors and managers to complete them each quarter.
That's a good question, Doug. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's important. Again, it has a lot to do with the simplicity of what you're asking for in those quarterly conversations. So making sure that, again, it's something that is lightweight and transparent. I think it's important. Our best customers literally do a program rollout where the CEO and the worldwide head of HR programatize the effort and saying, here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it, here's why we're going to get 100% participation. And so for the first couple of quarters, it is a little bit of a push, but then people start to see the benefit of it, and then they get over the top of that. So, one of the important things that we say to HR leaders, that you really need leadership buy-in to program change. And you need to help them, and we help them understand, here's what's going to go down in the next 4 quarters. And you're going to have a couple quarters of people stirring because I moved their cheese. It's a new process. But you have to expect that in the 3rd and 4th quarters, people will start to say, oh, okay, I get this. I understand why we're doing this. I see the benefit now, and they get to the adoption that they're looking for.
Yeah, and I would say, Sabina, from what we're seeing in the research, the first conversation that anyone should be having about systems these days is, what's our change management process? And I know people tend to think of change management as a project, I put it in place and it ends when it goes live. Mm-hmm. Our research shows that change management goes through the life cycle of the entire software, and so you really have to think about the fact that you're continuously educating, continuously reminding people about what these applications are meant to do in the organization. And that you think about calibration. I think I mentioned this, I think, in the blog that you guys posted along with this webinar, that the first change may not always be the perfect change. I think that's what, Doug's saying, like, you might have to come back and simplify it. It's okay to say, we are continuously improving this process. I think that's oftentimes HRs are really scared of doing that. And that's something we see works really well too.
Well, and Stacy, we have a lot of analytics in our product too, that are there for HR and for managers to look at, to see where adoption is occurring, where adoption isn't occurring. So we can go out and reach to a manager saying, hey, there seems to be a problem here. Your people aren't doing their, quarterly check-in, what's the process you're using with them in order to get that done? And so we try to help you at least know by looking at the system where problems might be occurring.
Yeah, that's great, where the calibration can take place. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Here's more of a tactical. What tactics do you use to get employees and managers excited about check-ins instead of dreading them?
Well, and again, for me, it's building a rolling out program and helping me understand the why. When you just roll a new program out and don't really tell people, why am I moving to this new program? They're like, oh my God, it's back to the tax question. Here's just something else I have to do. If they understand what the value was going to be ongoing, then they're likely to do it.
Yeah, and I think based on what you said, Doug, some of the value is tying it to development. We've seen that one of the number 2 reasons people are frustrated with their performance applications is the integration conversation. I think making sure people understand, if I have this quarterly conversations, that means I'm going to get some extra development. That means I'm going to get some extra help. That means you're going to go out and be an advocate for something I'm trying to do. I think managers in particular need to be educated on the fact that those conversations aren't just to tell me how well you're doing in your performance, but for the manager to figure out what they need to do to help. I think we find that makes a big difference in the conversations we've had.
Really important, Stacy. And then we recommend you have 2 to 3 goals that are tied to company achievement, your achievement for the company. But then 1 or 2 what's the company doing for you? and a conversation about who do you want to be longer term and how can I help you get there. We have integrations with people like LinkedIn Learning and Udemy, so you can literally reach out and grab 2 classes in Udemy, and you're going to do those over the next 90 days, and and make that one of your goals, kind of thing. So.
One question is more on definition. So what do you consider talent in a performance management process?
Stacy, you want to answer that one?
Well, it's funny. A few years back, I had this big presentation I used to do on understand what talent really means in your organization, right? Which was the idea that, I think we started off in the world of talent was the right person, the right place, and the right job, right? It was always this idea that I had the perfect person. I think today, especially in the world we're living in, with a much better focus on bringing your whole self to work, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and where we want to be as human beings, talent is about understanding what opportunities you as an employee have with the company and what opportunities the company has with you as an employee. So it really is getting down to the fact everybody has a role in the organization. You just have to figure out what that role is. And there's always the fact that you're going to be growing into roles too. So my sense is that the term talent has changed a lot over the last probably 5 years. Now you might have people who are higher performers, but that doesn't mean I think that they are, the word talent applies to just one set of people inside of an organization.
Yeah. And it's a word you don't even have to use candidly in the process. Just, it's that's where that question's coming from. You don't have to call it talent. I mean, just you want to know where your potential leaders are. Yeah. Your future leaders.
Talking about higher performers, so how do you differentiate performance and know your highest performers without using ratings? Additionally, how do you ensure you have a healthy distribution of talent across the organization if you don't categorize them?
Yeah. I think that's a great question, Doug, for you. I think it's where we were heading with it.
Yeah, again, I think you can use other processes other than ratings to determine where you find talent. I happen to be a fan of the 9-block process, which is, again, looking at a body of work of individuals, and based upon the feedback they've been getting, the goal attainment they've been achieving, the feedback and the recognition, we put you in what we think your potential is inside of the 9-block. And many of you maybe not know what a 9-block is, but one axis is potential and the other axis is time. And it's knowing where your future leaders might be and making sure that you've built programs around them and knowing that you're helping them build additional skills because they're your future leaders. And there's also where you use that data to drive your compensation determinations.
So moving with that, not all organizations are fully egalitarian. So in nature, then they can eliminate ratings. So, and also geographic cultures and regions. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's always been a little difficult. There's definitely European cultures, Asian cultures, that hierarchy is still an important part of their process. But, again, we just try to, we just try to find those companies that will progress and find new ways to do performance management, are willing to go to a workers' council in Germany and present a new process to the organization that they think is valuable. It's a continuum. I mean, there's the people that have been moving to something progressive in the last, 10 years, they're early adopters. They understand the value of building a new process and differentiating themselves in the market that way. And then there's people who tend to want to wait culturally until they see the effects of these new ways of doing things, and then they feel confident to make that move. And we try to spend our time finding those people that, again, realize people are their most incredible, important asset, and finding a CEO who knows that, with an HR person who knows that and wants to bring in a better experience for the people inside the organization so they can hire the best talent.
Yeah, and Sabina, I would only just add to that, because I think that's a great way of sort of looking at it, is the idea of a continuum. We see sort of software software can be a catalyst for change, but I think within those different regions and within those environments where the cultures are very different, you have to take some stock of what can change, and to some extent, what are we willing to push the borders on? Because a lot of times we'll get organizations who want to see change, but they don't know how to have that, how to make that conversation happen. And these are opportunities to start to sort of push for change if you think it's important. And if you think there's an opportunity, then it's a lot of education and conversation with leaders.
Excellent.
And Stacy, we're somewhere on the continuum today.
Yeah.
I'm a fan of Jeffrey Moore and some of the research he does. He talks about crossing the chasm and going from early adopters to Main Street. And
yeah.
I think we're getting close to being on Main Street where people of all kinds will see the value of this. If I could be maybe even a little more aggressive in my conversation, I lived through when I was at Cisco Systems watching Amazon destroy borders, or Uber and the impact it had on the taxi or in the world. I think people are at a point now where they need to build processes that if they don't change those processes in HR, they won't be able to find the best people, and therefore they're going to get out innovated. And I think you also said an important thing. Setting annual goals in today's environment is risky. You need to be looking at your competition on an ongoing basis. And if you need to change a goal on the fly, that's an important attribute of what you have to do in today's world.
It's critical. And we can't underestimate the power, I think, of HR to maybe hold a mirror up to business leaders and say, if you keep running the way you're going to run, we won't be here, right?
So you see, those are my favorite people. Yeah. Honestly, when I talked about finding a progressive HR person, that's it. It's like, hey, Mr. CEO, if you keep doing this, and by the way, you have 3 leaders on your team that need not to be here. That's an important attribute of a really strong HR person.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think we're running towards the end. So I want to thank both Doug and Steve for being with us today. And we would love to thank everyone here for attending today's webinar, Connecting the Dots, a new model for people-centric performance management. I would love to wish all of you a great day. Thanks you.
Thanks for listening. Bye now.
Thanks, everyone. It was great seeing everyone.
Thanks, Stacy.
Yeah. Thanks, Doug.